Episode 37, Chapter 35. Chapter 35. It seemed to Link that summer arrived in the rest of Hyrule sometime on his journey to Free Meadow. When he appeared in Kakariko Village, standing next to Spirit, he immediately noticed the humid heat of an oppressive sun overhead. It wasn't anything as bad as Death Mountain, but it made his brow break out in sweat almost immediately, nonetheless. Below him, the village bustled as always. Farmers worked their fields, harvesting winter crops or continuing to tend their spring-planted ones, which Link thought seemed to have grown considerably since he was last here 2 weeks prior. Link smiled at the peaceful nature of the village. As he made his way down from the shrine into the village proper, Sheikah began to call out to him, waving jovially and asking him how he was doing. He didn't know many of their names, yet they all knew him. Yet, despite his normal misgivings about people knowing him, it didn't bother him as much in Kakariko Village. He made his way towards Impa's large home but hesitated when he saw someone that he didn't recognize. The man seemed simple enough, tall with a medium build, white Sheikah hair pulled into a high top knot, and clothes that left one arm and shoulder exposed, revealing a floral tattoo on his left shoulder. He was older than Link, certainly, but like with many Sheikah, it was difficult to tell how much older due to their hair color and long lifespan. The man had his finger to his chin, looking down at an easel and canvas thoughtfully. He held in his other hand a narrow-tipped paintbrush. Beside him a small table had been set up with a multitude of paints of various colors and several other brushes. Normally, Link likely wouldn't have paid the man a second thought, but with the Yiga threat in his recent memory, the man stood out. He was clearly studying Impa's home with a critical eye. Perhaps he was just creating a painting of the house, which was beautiful in its own right, but Link couldn't shake the nervous feeling that seeing the man gave him. He watched the man for a time before approaching Dorian, who stood dutifully before the bridge that led up to Impa's home. Kato wasn't present, but Link thought he saw him tending his cuckoos on the way into town. The Sheikah guard didn't notice him until he was nearly upon them. He, too, seemed to be watching the painter with keen interest.
Link,
Dorian said, eyes widening.
You're back so soon. I just came from Rito Village,
Link said, patting the Sheikah slate at his waist.
Would you see if someone could take Spirit to the stable for me? I don't know if I'll be staying the night in the village yet. Rito Village? Did you not say you were going to Gerudo Desert?
Link hesitated, silently cursing himself. He had almost forgotten about his duplicity when leaving the town.
My plans changed shortly after leaving the village. Of course,
Dorian said. He still looked confused, however.
I take this to mean that you will be going to the desert next. Yes, but... Actually, if you wouldn't mind keeping that to yourself, I would appreciate it. I'm trying to keep the progress of my journey quiet for now.
Dorian nodded.
Yes, I understand. I'm sure you do not wish to always have to answer questions about it. Something like that.
Link hesitated. Dorian was Impa's guard. Surely that meant he was trustworthy, right? Impa would not have placed him into her service without reason to trust him. He glanced back over his shoulder at the painter.
Who is he?
He looked back at Dorian to see his face darken slightly.
His name is Pikengo. He only arrived in the village a few days after you left. You don't trust him?
Dorian glanced down at Link.
I do not trust many outsiders. Especially those whose histories I cannot confirm. Do you think he might be a Yiga spy?
Dorian started at the word, looking sharply at Link.
You know of the Yiga? I have encountered them on my travels.
Dorian still looked confused, so Link lowered his voice and continued.
One of them tried to kill me on the way to Death Mountain. And a few more were waiting for me when I came back down the mountain.
Dorian's face paled noticeably. He looked horrified.
I didn't know. I hadn't heard that any of them found you. How could you have? I only told Impa and Paya. It's why I lied about my destination. I wanted to throw off any assassins that might have been waiting for me. I see. Listen, keep this to yourself. I don't know what my next steps are going to be yet, but with any luck, if there are spies in Kakariko Village, they'll think I went to the desert and report that I'll be on my way to see the Rito next.
Dorian nodded slowly, though his face still remained almost as white as his hair. Sheikah truly were disturbed by the mention of their splinter clan.
Is Impa in? I need to let her know of my progress. Yes, she's inside. Please, go on up.
Link started up the bridge, but Dorian called back after him a moment later. He turned around to find Dorian looking up at him.
But you did it, didn't you? You freed another of the divine beasts. Yeah. There's only one left.
Dorian's lips upturned into a satisfied smile. He nodded to Link and turned back, waving down a passing Sheikah to take Spirit to the stable. Hope, Link thought as he continued up towards Impa's home. Every divine beast I defeat brings hope. He gently rapped on the wood of the doorframe before sliding the door open and peering inside.
Impa? Paya? Link.
Paya appeared a moment later in the doorway, looking slightly disheveled. Her cheeks were flushed.
Please, come in.
She opened the door wide and let him into the entry hall. All of the pillows had been stacked to the sides of the room, and Link noticed that some of the floor appeared to be damp. He glanced at Paya and saw that she held a wet towel in her hand.
Cleaning again, hey?
Link said. Paya held up the towel, looking slightly embarrassed.
I really do more than just clean, you just always seem to come around when I am.
Her cheeks flushed a deeper red, which stood out on her normally pale skin.
Paya.
Impa's voice called from one of the back rooms.
Who's here? Whoever it is, tell them to come back later. I'm busy. It's Link, grandmother.
There was a moment of silence that was then filled with the sounds of Impa's walking staff tapping the wood floor. She emerged from behind one of the staircases a moment later, eyes shining with excitement.
You did it,
she said.
Meadow is free,
Link said, returning her smile. For a moment, Impa looked far younger than her years. She stood up straighter, and her grin grew even wider. Then her eyes flicked to the still open door. Her smile faltered slightly.
Close the door, Paya.
Paya did as told, sliding the door shut. She then turned, going to the stacks of pillows and removing 3.
Leave those there. I'm not finished with my oatmeal yet.
Impa smirked slightly as Paya dutifully put the pillows back. She met Link's eyes and winked.
Come on, you can tell me about it while I eat.
She led Link back into her small kitchen, which despite having been used recently, was as immaculately clean as the rest of the house. Paya followed quickly, her chores forgotten for the time being. Impa walked over to the small, knee-high table, and settled herself down onto a small pillow. She motioned for Link to sit across from her, which he did.
Want anything?
Impa asked, picking up her wooden spoon and taking a bite. Link shrugged but nodded. He had breakfast not long ago, but it would be good to eat something other than fish.
Paya, why don't you get Link a bowl?
As Paya set about preparing a bowl of the oatmeal for Link, Impa fixed her stare back on Link.
Now, how are the Rito doing? I haven't been out that way for 100 years, but the way that Bard talked about them, it sounded like not much has changed for them from before the calamity.
Link began to tell Impa of his experiences in Rito village, the way they seemed to still be flourishing, despite the presence of Meadow and the food shortages, the Hylian logging community, and how they were doing now that the divine beast had been tamed. A minute later, Paya approached, placing a wooden bowl of steaming oatmeal down in front of Link.
Would you like some sugar? It's pretty bland without it. Sure, thanks.
Paya smiled at him and rose, looking to the shelf. She frowned after a moment, however, and turned back to the table, scanning the items atop it. A moment later, she gasped and, to Link's surprise, glared at Impa.
Grandmother. What?
Impa said, suddenly defensive.
You added sugar to your oatmeal. You know that you're not supposed to do that. You're the one who just said it's bland without it. To Link. Link can handle a little extra sugar in his diet, I'm sure, but you need to be more careful. You aren't as young as you used to be. Bah.
Paya reached down, snatching up the small jar of sugar from the table, still shooting her grandmother a fierce glare. She spooned out some of it into Link's oatmeal, and then turned back to the shelf. She set it on the highest shelf, standing on her toes to do so well outside of Impa's reach. She walked back over and sat down next to Link likely so she could keep glaring at Impa. Link grinned, and Impa shot him a dangerous look.
You would best wipe that smile from your face, boy. It's just that I don't think I've ever quite seen this side of you two before.
Paya looked at him, and her cheeks flushed again. But she still sat up straight.
Not many people get to see all that I do to keep grandmother healthy. I'm healthy enough,
Impa said, scowling, before returning to her bowl of oatmeal.
Honestly, girl, you make it out to be a terrible burden. It wouldn't be so terrible if you didn't keep sneaking sweets when I have my back turned. You told me to clean the audience room just to get me out of sight, didn't you?
Impa looked at her with a sly smile. Paya sighed, shaking her head. Link awoke suddenly, looking around the dark room that he was in. Moonlight streamed in through the window in his room at the inn, illuminating the sparse furniture in pale light. Nothing moved in the room, yet something felt off to him. His instincts screamed that he was in danger. Under attack. He threw the blankets off of him and stood up, looking around. He found his sword where he had left it, sitting in its sheath against his headboard, within reach, even when lying in bed. He unsheathed it, holding it firmly in his left hand, and went to the window, looking outside. Nothing moved. The door to his room burst open, and he whirled, dropping into a defensive stance, ready to lunge or dodge as needed. Paya stood in the doorway, dressed in her thin nightgown with a cloak draped over her shoulders. Her hair was down, and her face lacked the makeup that it normally bore. She looked at Link with terrified eyes. Link lowered his sword, stepping forward.
Paya, what is it? It's grandmother, she said.
Now that he was closer to her, he could see her trembling.
She's been taken. Taken? By who?
Biting her lip, she glanced down to a round object held in her hands. Link followed her gaze. In her hand was a white mask, emblazoned with the upside eye of the Sheikah clan. Link stared at the mask, his heart thudding loudly in his head. They finally made their move, it would seem, but why this one? Why Impa? He turned, snatching up his tunic and slipping it on over his head.
What happened? They ignored you. No, one of them tried to take me as well.
Link straightened and looked around, suddenly worried that one of the Yiga might be ready to burst into the room, chasing her. But then he saw her expression. There was terror, there, yes, but a hardness that he hadn't seen before. He looked at her more carefully, taking in her appearance. Her nightgown was largely covered by the cloak over her shoulders, but now that he studied her appearance, he could see the dark stains.
Are you hurt?
Paya shook her head.
Good.
He turned back and put his legs into his trousers, pulling them up and cinching his belt on over the tunic. He strapped the sword on over his shoulder and placed the ancient sword in his belt. He wouldn't be caught weaponless against these warriors again. He left the shield, it would only slow him down in this case, and he valued flexibility over defense in a fight such as this. After strapping the Sheikah slate to his waist, he looked back at Paya.
Do you know where they went?
She nodded and turned, hurrying out. He followed but hesitated when out in the common room. Earlier in the night, he saw Pikango in the common area earlier and had caught a glimpse at the location of his room. He motioned for Paya to wait and walked to the door, reaching out hesitantly and slowly turning the doorknob. Unlocked. Link pushed the door open and peered into the dark room. His eyes fell on the empty bed. He turned away, expression hardening. Together, he and Paya hurried out of the inn. The village remained quiet. No alarms had been sounded. The strike on Impa's home had been surgical and silent. If Paya failed to fend off her attacker, then Link wouldn't have even known of the attack. Then why kidnap them at all? He thought as they crossed the open square. Why not just kill me in my sleep? He hadn't even barricaded his door last night. He felt safer in Kakariko village than other places and hadn't even thought of it after the pleasant evening with Impa and Paya.
Where are the guards?
Link asked when he saw that no guards were posted outside of the home.
Dorian went after them when I came out. He said that he thought he saw movement up the hill towards the forest.
Link nodded and paused by the entrance to the home. He glanced back towards Paya, hesitating.
Paya, this is likely going to be a trap. You don't have to accompany, if you don't want. I'll get her back.
She looked at Link and shook her head.
I need to do my part, too.
He nodded towards their dark home.
Then go get dressed. You won't be able to fight very well in that.
Paya glanced towards the moonlit hill, hesitating, but then turned and hurried up the bridge and into her home. Link followed, eyes darting around for any movement. It was possible that the Yiga could still be close by. Once inside, he saw the signs of the fight. Paya had already gone up to her room, but the body of the Yiga lay in the center of the audience chamber, face down in a pool of dark blood. Grimacing, Link bent down and turned the body over, looking into the lifeless eyes of an unfamiliar man. He still had the knife in his chest. Paya emerged a minute later, moving down the stairs with surprising silence. He looked up, and his eyes widened when he saw her. She wore dark blue, tight-fitting clothing that covered her from neck all the way down to her toes. The Sheikah eye was emblazoned on her chest, but even this was a darker color than he normally saw it. Her neck was protected by a thick scarf, and a mask covered her nose and mouth, leaving only her eyes visible. Her hair had been pulled back in a tighter bun than she normally wore, ensuring it wouldn't get in her way. She had a curved Sheikah blade sheathed on her lower back, and he saw two thin daggers, one on her hip, and one under her left armpit.
That is,
Link said, feeling a little stunned at her appearance. This was not the Paya he had come to know through quiet conversations on the balcony. He cleared his throat.
Are you ready?
She nodded. They moved as quietly as they could. Paya, with her outfit carefully tailored for stealth, made little noise at all. Link did what he could to emulate her posture, but they also didn't have time to waste on perfecting his stealth.
How did they get past the guard?
Link asked as they climbed the hill, whispering so only Paya could hear.
I don't know, she said. They just appeared in our room in a puff of smoke. One grabbed grandmother right away, she was in bed. The other one tried to get me, but we fought and fell down the stairs.
She didn't elaborate further, but Link could guess what happened after that. The fight in the audience chamber. The knife.
It never occurred to me that you would know how to fight. Grandmother made sure I was trained in Sheikah fighting techniques, but...
Link saw her shudder in the darkness. Yes, she knew how to fight, how to kill, but that did not make one a killer. Not like him.
You did great. When we find them, focus on getting Impa to safety. I'll handle the Yiga.
Hopefully they won't care about Impa once I arrive, Link thought grimly. The Yiga will spring their trap, and the two of them can escape. He glanced down to the Sheikah slate on his hip, positioning his fingers over the icons. The screen gave no indication by touch which rune he was pressing, but he was able to judge fairly well where each rune was located without looking at it. It would be a last result. He didn't want to start flinging explosives around with innocents nearby. They reached the glowing shrine, looking around hesitantly. The nearby forest seemed dark this night, save for a handful of fireflies visible in the shadows. Link glanced towards Paya, but she shook her head. Neither of them had any idea where the Yiga had gone from here, assuming they even came up this way. There was no sign of Dorian, either. While they found some tracks in the dirt on the way up, hoping to find clear tracks in the forest at night would be difficult, even for an experienced hunter.
Stay behind me,
Link said, and then set out into the forest. He didn't set out on the path that led into the heart of the forest, choosing instead to remain in the shadows, carefully watching his steps. No sticks on the ground, he thought as they made their way between the trees. He looked at the ground, looking for any sign of broken branches or twigs, but nothing but lush grass, plants, and flowers covered the ground. He recalled noticing that the first time he had visited this forest as well. Unfortunately, there was no mystical rabbit-like creature there tonight. The forest all around them was dark and surprisingly quiet. He could hear night insects chirping, but they seemed somehow muffled. After a few minutes, Link stopped and held up a hand. He heard nothing behind him, so he looked over his shoulder. Paya was there, though barely visible in her dark clothing. So quiet. She doesn't make a sound when she moves. She may not have been a warrior by nature, but she clearly took instruction seriously. He looked back around, squinting as he gazed around the dark forest. The canopy overhead had grown so thick that almost no moonlight shone down through it. Anyone could be out there, watching. Waiting. Suddenly, a firefly burst into life just beyond a tree in front of Link. Its green light seemed too bright in the darkness, illuminating the dark bark of the tree. It faded after a few seconds, leaving a glowing afterimage in Link's sight. For a time, there was darkness again, and then another firefly began to glow. And another. He slowly stepped forward, and as he did so, another several fireflies flickered to life. They seemed to form a line through the trees, as if they were leading them to a destination. He glanced back towards Paya and saw that her eyes were wide over her mask. This is insane, Link thought as he followed the line of fireflies. Yet he felt a strong pull in his heart to do so. It was as if the forest itself wanted to lead him deeper. The children called the forest magic. And I saw that creature here. They reached a place, much deeper in the forest, where the moonlight pierced the canopy, shining down onto a small clearing. Link hesitated at the border of trees, looking into the clearing with cautious eyes. He felt, rather than heard, Paya stop beside him. Suddenly, fireflies all around them burst to life. Dozens, no, hundreds of glowing green lights floated around them. In the trees, in the clearing, from within bushes and on flowers. Slowly Link stood up straighter, gazing around in awe as the forest was lit up around them. Paya slowly lowered her mask, looking around with an expression of amazement. Link met her eyes and, despite the dire situation, smiled. She returned his smile, no hint of the normal anxiety she displayed around him in her expression. She was quite pretty. That's when Link heard the voices. The fireflies around them winked out all at once, plunging them back into darkness. Paya raised her mask back into place. Link silently unsheathed his sword. Together, they creeped through the trees towards the source of the sound.
Don't need to do this. I'm here, let her go.
They made their way a short distance to another clearing, this one before a narrow brook that bisected the forest. Nearby, a small wooden bridge made from fig tree branches strapped together crossed the water. Across the bridge lay a meadow lit by the full moon overhead. Dorian stood there, his curved Chica sword held in his right hand. Another figure stood in the center of the clearing. He was tall and broad-shouldered. His clothing the color of blood and his stark white mask identified him as Yiga, though he wore more armor than the first one Link had fought. He carried a wickedly long sword by his side, held in both hands.
We warned you, Dorian. You knew what would happen if you tried to leave the organization.
The tall Yiga said. Paya placed a hand on Link's shoulder, stepping up beside him. She leaned close, whispering into his ear.
That's not the one that took grandmother.
Link nodded, studying the edges of the clearing. Where was the other one? Where was Impa? There. He could just see a short form huddled against one of the trees. It was difficult to make out, but he thought that it must have been Impa. No sign of the other Yiga, though. How many were there?
I know full well the cost of leaving the organization,
Dorian spat, adjusting his grip on his sword.
And I'm here to pay it. Just let her go. Let the others be.
The Yiga chuckled.
Oh, don't be dumb. Your life holds no worth to us now. It, alone, cannot cover the cost.
He held his sword out, inspecting its shining blade in the moonlight.
No, much more blood than yours must flow tonight to repay us for your transgression. Only after you have watched your children perish will I allow you to die. I won't let you harm them.
Dorian lowered himself into a warrior's stance.
You'll never harm someone I care about again.
Behind Dorian, stepping out silently from behind a tree, another Yiga member appeared. This one was of a much smaller, lither build, much like Delilah had been. He crouched low as he approached Dorian from behind. Link stiffened. This wasn't a trap for him. It was a trap for a member of their own clan. It was a trap for Dorian.
Dorian, behind you.
Link said, running out from behind the tree. Dorian whirled, slashing his sword towards the smaller Yiga, who leapt back and disappeared in a flash of smoke and light.
What?
The taller Yiga said, looking at Link.
You.
Link ran across the bridge to stand next to Dorian, who looked at him with a shocked expression. He didn't hear Paya run up behind him, and he hoped that she would be on her way to free Impa and get her to safety. He couldn't do anything to signal to her now, however he didn't dare let the Yiga know that she was there.
You didn't tell us that this one had returned,
the Yiga said, looking back to Dorian. Dorian looked away from Link and looked defiantly up towards the Yiga.
How fortunate, then, that you let him into our trap anyway. The calamity truly smiles down upon us this night.
Enough of this, Link thought. He lunged toward the tall Yiga, thrusting his sword for his heart. The Yiga stepped back, bringing his own sword to bear.
Cover my back,
Link said, thinking of the way the other Yiga had approached. Dorian said nothing but took up a position behind Link. Link and the Yiga began to dance. The Yiga had the advantage of reach, his sword was easily twice as long as Link's, but Link struck out in quick blows that the heavier sword had trouble keeping up with. The Yiga swung his sword wide, and Link rolled under the blade, thrusting his sword up towards his opponent's gut. Its tip tasted blood, but the Yiga backed up before it could any significant damage. He swore in a language that Link didn't understand, placing a hand over the bloody spot on his stomach, and then looked at Link. And then, in a puff of smoke, he disappeared.
Above you!
Dorian cried. Link leaped forward as the Yiga reappeared, swinging his sword down in a chopping motion, separating him from Dorian. Dorian attempted to attack the Yiga, but the Yiga backhanded him, sending him sprawling to the ground. The Yiga wrenched his sword's tip out from where it had embedded in the ground and thrust it at Link's heart. Link parried it with his sword and reached forward, grabbing the larger man's wrist with his right hand. He heaved the Yiga over his shoulder, flipping him and slamming him to the ground. In a clean motion, Link reversed his grip on his sword and plunged it down towards the stunned Yiga's heart. Suddenly, a sickle caught Link's blade like a hook, pulling him off balance and sending the sword's tip into the ground beside the Yiga. He leaped back, putting some space between him and the now 3 Yiga. 2 more had joined the fight, each wielding their curved sickles. The taller one rolled to his feet and held his sword out to the front, staring at Link. Dorian stepped up beside Link again, holding his sword in a defensive stance. The standoff continued for another moment, and then the 2 smaller Yiga began to flank to the sides, seeking to surround them. Should have brought the shield, Link thought, wryly. He pulled his ancient sword free of its place on his belt and ignited it in his right hand. Its blue blade shone in the night, and the Yiga paused for just a moment. And then they attacked. One of the Yiga leaped in with her sickle, aiming its tip for Link's throat. He knocked it aside with his blade, but the taller Yiga's blade followed a moment later. Link blocked this with the ancient sword, which crackled with energy when the blades met. It didn't cut through the long sword, but that was likely only because the Yiga pulled the sword back almost immediately. Link could see a deep cut in the blade, the edges of which glowed with red heat. The 3rd Yiga attacked Dorian behind Link, but he couldn't spare them a glance for the moment. The taller Yiga seemed stunned by what had happened to his sword, but the 2nd Yiga attacked again, lashing out with the same grace that Delilah had. She fought viciously, striking with blindingly fast strikes. Link was not defenseless this time, however. He caught her blade with his own and then stabbed forward with the ancient sword, but she slapped his wrist to the side and then attempted to grab his left arm. Trying to use my own move against me. He twisted his arm out of her grip. He kicked her back with his boot and dodged as the large Yiga's blade almost split his head in 2. Link tried slicing the Yiga's arm, but he moved with quickness that belied his size. Before Link could follow, the other Yiga was upon him again, her sickle passing by his arm close enough to create a small gash in the fabric of his tunic. He held his breath, focusing on the moment. Everything around him slowed. He looked into the white mask of the Yiga woman, who had overextended in her attempt to catch him off guard. And then he thrust his sword into her heart. Everything began to move around him again, and Link wrenched his sword free, crashing it against the taller Yiga's blade, which snapped where his ancient sword had cut. The half that spun free left a cut in Link's arm as it passed before sinking, tip first, into the ground. Link went in for the kill, his face a mask of rage. Never again, he thought as he stabbed out towards the Yiga. You'll never harm those who I'm sworn to protect again. The Yiga parried him, but barely, backing away. Not Impa. Link swung, and the Yiga blocked. Not Paya. Link tried to stab the Yiga's arm with his ancient sword, but the Yiga leaped back and then lunged forward, swinging. Not Zelda. All around him, battle raged. Dorian fought the Yiga, but he fared poorly, sporting several shallow cuts on his arms and chest. Paya fought as well, engaged in a battle against a 4th Yiga who wielded a pair of circular blades with spiked edges. The Yiga Link stabbed lay dying on the ground. And, in his mind's eye, Link could see 3 other Yiga closing in on Princess Zelda, who ran for her life. The tall Yiga's sword swung for Link's side, but he parried it, spinning into the Yiga's guard. He reversed the grip on his ancient sword and plunging it into the Yiga's neck. He wrenched the crackling blade free and deactivated it, shoving it into his belt. He ran for Dorian. The Yiga that he fought noticed Link and leaped back, disappearing suddenly in a puff of smoke. He reappeared in the air several feet away and hovered there just long enough to fling a set of throwing knives towards Link. One lodged into Link's right shoulder, but he barely felt it at the moment. When the Yiga fell to the ground, Link was there. The Yiga desperately tried to defend himself, hastily pulling out his sickle to block, but Link knocked it free with a powerful two-handed chop that broke the Yiga's wrist. The Yiga's life ended a split second later.
Link.
Impa's voice. Link whirled and saw the last Yiga score a hit on Paya's shoulder, one of the spikes digging deep. Paya gasped and backed away, holding her bleeding shoulder. Something awoke inside of Link. A primal rage unlike anything else he had felt since waking, but one that he was keenly familiar with all the same. He sprinted forward, crossing the distance with more speed than seemed possible. As the Yiga prepared to strike Paya down, Link reached her, placing a hand on Paya's shoulder and shoving her back. He caught the circular blade between two of its spikes with his sword and twisted, breaking the Yiga's grip. He was the only thing that stood between this foul being and those he would protect. Nothing would befall them while he was there. Link struck. The Yiga tried to fend him off with his remaining blade, but such a weapon was not made for direct confrontation with a sword. Link sank his blade into the Yiga's chest, ending the last assassin's life a moment later. He trembled slightly as he turned, looking at those around him. Dorian, who looked at him with abstract horror. Impa, who watched him with a keen eye, satisfied. Zelda, who looked upon him with utter shock from her place on the ground. No. It wasn't Zelda, it was Paya, so why? And then Link remembered. That damn princess. Link tried. He tried, damn it. Despite their differences, despite her animosity towards him, Link kept his temper. He kept silent, refusing to say what he really thought of her attitude towards him. He had even been willing to forgive her brash words, spoken in misdirected anger after she apologized for the incident by the Sheikah shrine. He had hoped that things would change after that. And, perhaps, they had even begun to. She certainly seemed kinder after her apology for a few days on their way to Gerudo Desert. But eventually, she grew surly again, often sighing to herself when she looked at him. And, of course, then they reached the desert, and she tried to leave him behind again. Succeeded, in fact, much to Link's frustration. Urbosa had attempted to help him reconnect with her in a number of ways, but her most recent ploy had backfired. She had likely embarrassed Princess Zelda too much with her practical joke the night before, which led to this. A missing princess. Urbosa sent a team of Gerudo out on both horseback and sled to search the area around Gerudo town. She, herself, went straight for the divine beast, thinking that the princess had, perhaps, decided to get some time to herself for further study. Link, horseless and without a clue, chose to check the bazaar, thinking that she could have disguised herself. After all, a disguise could work to get into the city, why couldn't it work to get out? Every cloaked figure could be her, and he surreptitiously tried to verify the identity of each one, which proved difficult. Out in the desert heat, cloaks could be as much a lifesaver as they were in the frigid Hebra mountains. He glanced up towards the sun overhead. It was approaching midday, and the temperature still climbed. The wind had picked up as well, blowing dust and grit against his face. What if she's caught out in a sandstorm? He thought and inwardly grimaced. He should have just tried harder to talk to her last night. She asked him to speak, to tell her what he really thought of her, and he had just stayed silent. She assumed that he hated her. Which, as Link leaned against a palm tree in the small oasis, wasn't true. No, in fact, he actually found her presence to be quite pleasant, when she wasn't scowling at him. Those times when she seemed to forget her dislike of him, when she'd start speaking about her research and her hopes of what discoveries they might find. And he didn't think she was ever more beautiful than she was with her sleeves rolled up, working on some kind of internal component of a divine beast or digging in the dirt with pure awe. Goddess, he thought. What am I even thinking? He was fond of his princess, despite her prickly edges. Oh, he didn't like her temper, not when it was directed at him, anyway. And he was hurt by her seemingly irrational dislike of him, though he had long since realized that such feelings were very difficult for her to control. And then, of course, there was what Urbosa had told him the night before.
She gets frustrated every time she looks up and sees you carrying that sword on your back. It makes her feel like a failure when it comes to her own destiny.
It wasn't his fault that he had drawn the master sword. He hadn't expected anything to even happen. It was an accident. But, then, that was the real problem, wasn't it?
She's put in more than enough time. Ever since she was a young girl, she's gone through rigorous daily routines to show her dedication.
Link had seen them every day at dawn and dusk. Often before she even knew he was awake, or when she thought he had stepped away for a time. When she could, she would do it kneeling in a body of water, though he didn't fully understand why. She prayed every day for the blessing that seemed as though it would never come. To think that he had thought her impatient.
She really is quite special.
Urbosa had spoken of her with such fondness, such love. Watching the way she brushed the hair away from Princess Zelda's face, Link saw a mother's love in her eyes and tone. A mother, like the one that the princess barely even remembered. And, suddenly, Link understood. He understood everything. Why she acted the way she did, why she grew so angry at him, and why he had been so unable to find common ground with her. It wasn't all his fault, no, the princess still had quite the temper, and he felt that her anger was misplaced and irrational, but he also hadn't helped things. He had been silent when she wanted him to speak. He had been aloof when she needed a friend. He had crowded her when she needed space. He had stood behind her when, in fact, perhaps he should have been standing beside her. Why hadn't he seen it before? Urbosa claimed that he wasn't to blame for any of it, but was that really true? Had he not doggedly pursued the qualities of a noble knight, even when it was clear that such behavior did nothing to help? Perhaps his father had been right about a knight's duty, especially in the presence of royalty, but did Princess Zelda attempt to act like royalty when out of the castle? He had been a fool. And now? Screaming. Link pushed himself off of the tree. A cloaked figure from within the bazaar suddenly ran out of it. The figure ran, and as she did so, her hood blew back, revealing a familiar blonde braid. Princess Zelda ran. And she was pursued. One figure, at first. Cloaked, but his hood fell back as well, revealing another hood and white mask. And then he was joined by another, this one a woman. He saw her just briefly as she whirled, throwing her cloak to the ground. She donned a white mask and sprinted after the pair. And then, to his horror, a third Yiga clan member joined the chase, coming from the other direction, seeking to cut off the princess's escape.
You be sure to protect her with your life.
He sprang into motion, dropping his cloak and unsheathing the master's sword from his back. He had to move, to run harder than he had ever run before. He had to protect her. Zelda's cloak fell from her shoulders, finally discarded to aid her flight, yet it was too little. The Yiga easily gained on her, wearing shoes better designed for sand. Link's own boots sank into the sand too easily. While he and Zelda kicked up clouds of sand with every step, the Yiga seemed to barely leave footprints. He would never catch them in time. He could never save her in time. Link yelled, trying to get the Yiga's attention. Trying to do anything to stop what he knew would befall his princess. Yet they were single-minded in their pursuit, spreading out. Surrounding her. She came up short, hand to her breast, looking around in terror as she realized that her escape route was blocked by the third Yiga. She spun, trying to find another way, but the Yiga from earlier closed the gap. She whirled, only to stumble backwards and fall as her first pursuer shed his cloak, stepping forward and wielding a wicked sickle. The Yiga spun his sickle in his fingers casually and then raised it above his head, preparing to end her life.
No.
The Yiga's blade fell. The master's sword rose. The Yiga's blade spun away through the air. Link swept the sword down again in a two-handed cleave, cutting deep into the assassin from collar to rib. As the Yiga fell, Link turned, breathing heavily and looking at the remaining two would-be killers with a primal rage that he had never felt before. They would not have his princess. The two Yiga backed up a step, glancing at each other. Fear showed in their posture. They looked back at Link and took another step backward. Suddenly, with a puff of smoke and flame, they both disappeared into thin air. Link stayed there for a time, his chest heaving, waiting for a counterattack. Waiting for the assassins to make another move. They did not return, however, and Link became aware of a new sound. Sobbing. He turned the master's sword over, driving it point first down into the sand, and knelt beside Princess Zelda, who had buried her face in her hands.
Princess, he said. Are you alright? Did they hurt you?
She shook her head, though her body continued to shake with her cries. Hesitantly, Link reached out with an open palm, unsure of what he should do. What was appropriate? She decided that for him a second later, however. Princess Zelda looked up and saw his hand, just inches from her shoulder, and then she met his eyes. And then, in a rush of motion, she threw her arms around him, knocking him onto his backside, and clung to him, trembling with renewed sobs. Slowly, carefully, Link wrapped his arm around her shoulders and held her in his lap as she cried.
No.
Link cried, stumbling back from Impa and Paya. He shook violently, looking around with wide eyes at the dark forest. This wasn't right. This wasn't where he needed to be.
Link,
Paya said, but Link didn't hear her. He whirled. He saw the bodies of the Yiga. The assassins that had tried to murder his princess. He ended them, yet where was she? Where was Zelda? The castle. She's in the castle. He needed to protect her. He needed to save her. Link removed the Sheikah slate from his belt with trembling hands. The map. The map. Where was there?
Link, what are you doing?
Impa's voice. He ignored it, instead staring down at the blue icon that indicated the Sheikah shrine that he had activated just outside of Castle Town. He would protect his princess. Link pressed the icon, and his body broke apart into thousands of blue strands of light as he teleported away from the forest. To Hyrule Castle. End of chapter.